Wait, what even is the engineer? I think this calls for some rampant speculation. They build them big around here. As depicted in the game, the engineer is extremely tall. This is the engineer stood next to a tree, and here they're stood next to a tank. If you've ever seen either of these in real life, then you'll know they're pretty big. But the engineer is shown as being taller than a tank and about a third to half the height of a fully grown tree. If we imagine the trees are species similar to something like a larch, then that means they should be 20 to 50 metres tall. Therefore, the engineer would be between 7 to 15 metres tall. That's at least double the typical human height of about 1.5 to 1.8 metres tall. Either way, I don't think any of this means the engineer is actually super tall. Instead, I think the engineer is shown as being large because it's the player's avatar. And if they'd shown the engineer at their true size, then it would mean either everything else would need scaling up, which would make it difficult to get that nice top-down view of everything, or the player's character would be too hard to see on screen. So I think this is mostly a gameplay thing. But I also think it's quite likely that the engineer species is taller than an average human, just not this tall. And, just for the record, I think this scaling applies to a lot of things in the game. They're scaled for gameplay reasons, not for realism. That is, the engineer might be building functioning nuclear reactors that are of a similar scale to those on Earth, but there's no real gameplay benefit to showing them at that scale in the game. Oh, he thinks he's people. And, extending this further, the engineer's form factor, look, I know this is a weird way of putting it, but it'll make sense eventually, is very human-like. They are bipedal, that is, they have 2 legs. They also have 2 arms, and each arm ends with a hand, or at least something with opposable digits that allow them to grip things. They have a head, which presumably contains their brain and primary sense organs, seeing, hearing, etc. And they have a torso, where they presumably keep their heart and giblety stuffs. But there are also significant differences to human physiology. They don't eat, or at least they only eat fish to regain health. They don't drink. Indeed, water seems to kill them instantly. They heal very quickly, and they don't seem to break bones or lose limbs. And, it seems, they don't have to worry about all their skin being burnt off by fire or eaten away by acid. They're also incredibly strong. Chopping down trees in a couple of hits is no mean feat, even when we set aside the scale point I made earlier. In Space Age, it's shown that the engineer can easily survive huge pressures and both high and low temperatures that would kill a human very quickly. They also don't appear to be impacted by atmospheric gases, which is to say an atmosphere like on Vulcanus that's surely full of noxious gases is not a problem for the engineer. But I think most of these are probably for gameplay reasons. I think they probably do consume some form of nutrients for energy and water. But depicting that, and therefore having to add survival elements to the game, wouldn't really add anything fun. The healing thing is mostly just a convention in games, but they are perhaps a lot tougher than us. And I think that getting covered in highly corrosive acid is not as big a deal for them as it would be for us. The engineer's strength and survivability are interesting. I do think the engineer is more powerful and more robust than us humans, but I think they're also exaggerated for gameplay reasons. So maybe they can't quite knock over an 18-metre tall tree in a couple of hits, but they can do it a lot quicker and easier than us. And I think these traits in particular give strong hints about what the engineer is. More generally, I think the form factor of the engineer is primarily about gameplay. The engineer is your avatar in the game, and it's just easier to achieve immersion if the avatar is a human-like shape. But I also think this is true for lore reasons. There's a concept in biology called convergent evolution. This is where different, usually unrelated species end up evolving the same features or behaviours when faced with the same challenges. The classic example is the eye. The power and utility of being able to sense light and shadow is so powerful that it has evolved separately multiple times across multiple species in multiple eras. Of course, that includes eyes in the sense of a faceted eye like an insect's, but even eyes similar to ours have evolved several different times. The point is that it's not uncommon on Earth for different species to have the same basic solution to seeing, even if they're not identical solutions. Like, maybe they have different sensitivities to different wavelengths of light. For example, we can't see ultraviolet light, but some other animals can. Therefore, a human-like form factor, which is basically legs for locomotion, arms and hands for tool use, and the concentration of primary sense organs close to the brain, makes a lot of sense as being a repeated solution to the same evolutionary challenges. But more on these points later. I think many of them hint at what the engineer could be, but they also leave a lot of room for interpretation. Who's a clever boy then? The engineer is smart, like really smart, like twice as smart as Einstein and Newton combined, like maybe even smarter than the average bear smart. I mean, I don't know about you, but I couldn't even work out how to build a normal transport belt, let alone a fusion reactor. Yep, super smart. Or are they? When I look at the Factorio tech tree, to me, it seems incredibly well organised and thought out. It's not at all like real research where you don't know what's coming next. It's more like the engineer already knew that these sciences would work and how each science was interlinked. And maybe they just needed to work out how to make the stuff out of the local resources. So perhaps it's not really a research tech tree and maybe it's more like a path to localization. I think maybe everything in the tech tree is what the engineer's culture has already achieved. They already know how to do fusion power, and anyone can just look it up in their equivalent of Wikipedia. I'm suggesting that the engineer has essentially downloaded a database of all of their culture's knowledge. The problem they, and therefore we, are actually trying to solve is, how do I make these things using the local resources? So whatever culture the engineer is from is super advanced, and while they are a very good engineer, hence the name, they're not some uber genius inventor who goes around thinking up Tesla towers. Just hit it with a hammer. Have you ever wondered how the engineer can queue up a whole load of handcrafting while also doing other stuff? Yeah, no, I'm sure you haven't, but when you do think about it, it's a bit weird, isn't it? If you're using your hands to craft something, and you've only got two hands, then how can you shoot your gun at the same time? Surely you would need to stop whatever else you're doing so that you could handcraft all these gears, belts, circuits and inserters. Even if you did have a secret second pair of hands, no judgment here, then this is a pretty intense form of multitasking. We're supposed to believe the engineer can build every single thing that they've got queued up perfectly in the right order while also throwing a poison capsule and driving a tank. I know I said they were smart, but that's off the charts. Of course, the real explanation here is gameplay. It'd be annoying for the player if they had to completely stop and do nothing else but craft 100 transport belts. Factorio is not a survival game. And when you do something like that in a game like Satisfactory, it's both a bit tedious and you also know that you're not going to get attacked or have your base eaten. But if we assume it's real, then I think there's an interesting lore explanation that could tell us what the engineer is. More later. Ooh, guns, guns, guns. The engineer is skilled in combat. Perhaps not with handheld weapons. They're not necessarily 360 no-scoping biters in their sleep, but they are good at making weapons. They even know ways to increase firing speed and damage. This, to me, suggests they are from a culture that has had to use weapons in the past, or still does. This might seem like an obvious thing to say, but if we assume they are from a culture that does, or did, consume other animals for sustenance, then they would likely need some form of weapon to kill those animals. My point is that they've gone way beyond that. If all you need is bows, spears and knives to kill animals, you only go beyond that if you're facing some sort of significant threat from someone or something that is also capable of using such weapons. Let's use something like Star Trek as an example. They're human and have all of our history, so they develop weapons to fight each other. But one idea in the show is that there's now a single collective of humanity. That is, humanity no longer fights wars with itself. Yeah, I know, but that's one of the basic ideas. However, both their exploration and diplomatic classes of starship all have weapons, and advanced ones at that. This is partly because they have already encountered threats from other cultures in the galaxy, but it's also because they don't know if new cultures they encounter will be hostile and they'll need to defend themselves. They also have security personnel with a whole uniform colour for them, because they are a significant enough contingent to warrant it. The point I'm getting at is it could be the case that the engineer's culture is peaceful now, but at some point it had warlike tendencies and developed sophisticated weapons. These are what the engineer builds. Of course, they could easily still be a culture that fights wars. Indeed, they could be fighting one right now. My point is that the engineer's culture has encountered aggressive species before, or has, at least, needed to use sophisticated weapons. Crash bang wallop. Which brings me to touching on the question of why the engineer and their ship has crashed on Nauvis. I'm going to do a whole video on this, in fact maybe several, but the point is that they did crash on Nauvis. They didn't deliberately land there with the intention of exploring or colonising. Or maybe they were doing something else in the Nauvis system and something happened and they ended up crash landing on Nauvis. Either way, the engineer wasn't intending to be on Nauvis on their own. We could look at the tutorial here, which does touch on this, but for this video I'm really only thinking about the main freeplay mode. I'll leave the detailed speculation for other videos, but I do think that there's a distinct possibility that the engineer's ship was part of a fleet. Or perhaps it's an escape pod or a short-range vessel like a shuttle. Basically, it's quite small for a ship that's apparently travelled across the galaxy. I'll also leave the reasons for the engineer being there for the other videos, but I think the ship and the crash point to the following about the engineer. Firstly, they are a social species. That is, they are not a lone entity, but they have, or had, a home planet where there are multiple other engineers. Secondly, that species has experienced conflict and has developed advanced and powerful weapons as a result. You want to live forever? When the engineer dies, they respawn. Now clearly, there's an element to this that's gameplay related. It can be annoying to have to roll back to your last autosave, but the thing is the respawn is canon. When they respawn, the engineer's previous body is left on the ground and we can interact with it. Indeed, if we die multiple times, all of the previous bodies are left behind. So it must be real. The body exists and we can access its inventory. But how can that be? What is the engineer made of if they can simply be magically reconstituted instantly? They presumably have all of their memories intact. They even have clothes and a pistol. So what's going on here? Well, I think this is either an ability the engineer has, perhaps teleportation or something like that, or maybe the engineer's culture has developed this capability through technology. But either way, if this is a general thing that the engineer's culture can do, then it opens up some horrible possibilities about what happened to the rest of the crew of the crashed ship. Are they trapped in there, eternally dying and being reborn? Or did they manage to teleport away, leaving the engineer to a horrible fate on an alien world? We'll never know. Is that a nuclear reactor in your pocket, or are you just pleased to see me? One of the oddest things about the engineer is just how much they can carry in their pockets. I mean, I don't think I've ever met anyone else who can carry around 800 nuclear reactors. Of course, there are several possible explanations. For example, perhaps they have a sort of folded pocket dimension where they store all this stuff without any concern for size and weight. The engineer certainly seems to be able to build recursive chests which can hold multiple copies of themselves. If a chest can hold a chest, can a chest in a chest hold a chest? What about a chest in a chest in a chest in a chest? Anyway, this could also explain transport belts as well. The manipulation of space and dimensions seems to be something the engineer has absolutely no problem with. So perhaps that's why a foundry can be both a 5x5 entity and small enough to fit on a transport belt. In stacks. I think this whole area also maybe points to a partial explanation for the engineer's immortality and respawning. Perhaps when they die, as mentioned, the engineer's body is teleported away. That would mean that what was left and that we can interact with is actually just their clothes and this pocket dimension. But if they have technologies or capabilities like teleporting and pocket dimensions, why don't they use them elsewhere? Why aren't they on the tech tree? Well, I think maybe they do for certain things. There's the chests and transport belts that I already mentioned, but maybe that's also how bots can carry items that are hundreds of times bigger than they are. I also wonder if maybe these are just things that the engineer is so familiar with, they don't even think about it. They just inherently know how to create pocket dimensions. And maybe self-teleportation on death is just something that happens for their species. So, These are then inherently built into everything they do, not separate things that they develop. Perhaps that's part of the localization I mentioned. They aren't really researching transport belts, but how to apply this miniaturization capability to items from this part of the galaxy. Another possibility is that the engineer's body is not their real body. Perhaps this is an artificial body, and it gets rebuilt or remade when they die, and they're just not aware of the time this takes. Okay, so what is the engineer? I think there's a few strong possibilities and a few weaker ones. But I'm a nerd, and when a nerd wants an answer, they create a spreadsheet. So let's break this down. I put the various factors that I've been discussing up the side. So we've got height, strength, handcrafting, intelligence and knowledge, resistance to damage, fast healing, whether they need food or water, sustenance, physical robustness, and immortality. And what we're going to do is identify some options for what the engineer is and rate the likeliness that they match up with my observations. To do this, we're going to use a simple scale. Here, no means it's basically impossible or a very bad match, and we'll give it a score of 0. Next is unlikely, where there's maybe a vague possibility, but it's extremely unlikely, and that'll get a score of 1. Next up we have maybe, where there is a bit of a possibility, a bit of a likelihood, but it's not very strong, so we're going to give it 2. Next we have possible, where we're going to give it a score of 3. This represents a pretty good likelihood that this option explains the observed behaviour. Next up we have likely. This is where there's a pretty good match between what we've observed and the option that we're talking about, so we give that a score of 4. Next up we have a score of 5, the maximum score, which we're just calling yes. Yes represents it is a perfect explanation for the observed behaviour for that option. How we're going to do this is we're going to enter each score into the table. For example, we might say yes here. That will give a score of 5, and in the back end it calculates that and works it out as a percentage. As I say, I'm a nerd. Where you have the highest score, it will also identify that as the most likely option. Feel free to pick holes in my methodology in the comments below. Human. Let's start with setting a baseline. Is the engineer human? As I said in my analysis, being human doesn't align with the engineer being super tall, until we factor in the gameplay scaling thing. But even then, I don't think I can give this any more than a maybe. To me, the engineer just seems too tall to be human. Strength is just a no. There's no way a human could be that strong until you get the power armor technologies. Handcrafting. This only works with them being human if it's a gameplay thing. So I'm going to give this an unlikely score. In terms of intelligence and knowledge, we have to remember that this is a basic human similar to us. And I therefore think this is a no, because humans at the moment cannot build fusion plants. Damage resistance, I'm willing to give this a maybe. The reason for that is that you could argue that the resistance comes from the suit that the engineer is wearing, even before power armor. However, we don't really have anything like that just yet, so I think maybe is where I'm going to leave this. Healing. This only works if it's pure gameplay, in which case we'd need to disregard this category altogether. Just as a note, I thought about weighting the scores here based on whether the gameplay reason is actually a better explanation, but it got quite complicated and you wouldn't want to see that. Would you? As for the sustenance question, food and water, I mentioned in the analysis that a combination of gameplay and some advanced survival gear could maybe explain this. The problem I think though is the timescales. The longer the game goes on, and it can last hundreds of hours, which actually represents hundreds of days, it seems more and more unlikely to me that the engineer is surviving without food and water, if they're human. So I'm going to call this unlikely, but it's probably more edging towards no. Next two I think are pretty easy. The physical robustness has to be a no, because the conditions are just too extreme for a normal human to survive, even if you say they're wearing some advanced uniform that does give them extra protection. Until they have power armor or the mech armor, they just would not be able to survive the conditions on some of these planets. As for immortality, I don't know about you, but I'm not going to live forever, so that has to be a no as well. Okay, so that's our baseline, a likelihood score of just 13%. Let's look at some of the other options. Option 1, an alien. It's kind of the obvious answer, but perhaps the engineer is just some alien organism with different capabilities to us humans. I'll be honest, I don't really see this as particularly different from saying they are some sort of advanced human. But come on to that later. Let's compare this idea to our observations. Starting with height and strength, I think it's perfectly possible that an alien species could be bigger, taller, stronger than us. But even factoring that in, it is still very tall and very strong for a bipedal form factor. So I'll only mark this as likely rather than a yes. Skimming ahead a little, resistance to damage and being fast healing I think are again perfectly possible options for an alien being. However, what's shown in the game is actually pretty extreme in terms of speed of healing and resistance to damage, so I'm only going to put these as possible rather than likely. And I don't know about you, but I don't see why they couldn't be more intelligent and have more technology and knowledge than an average human, so we might as well put that as a yes. I think them having no need for sustenance is perhaps less likely, and being able to survive the extreme conditions on the planets in the game is also a bit of a stretch for me. They really are extreme conditions after all. That means sustenance and robustness get an unlikely and a maybe, respectively. But here we get into other possibilities. Maybe they're wearing a protective suit. We see in the tech tree that the engineer develops various forms of power armor, culminating in the mech suit. Perhaps then, the increase in survivability is more to do with some gear they have on, not fundamental traits. Think about how the still suit in Dune recycles water for the wearer to drink. Or, in the Predator movies, the alien's vision is based around heat, but they're shown as always wearing a helmet that extends this into things like motion detection and seeing other wavelengths. I think this is actually a pretty good example of what I mean. For the Predator, you can easily interpret its helmet as its face until it takes the mask off. Perhaps it's the same for the engineer. And it could also explain other things. For example, the power armor could recycle poop into sustenance. Or maybe their species photosynthesizes, so they don't need solid food. I think sustenance is therefore a little more likely for the alien scenario, but then I'm also kind of cheating. Let's just put this as an unlikely too. Another good example is handcrafting. You could imagine maybe that this alien species have mastered nanotechnology. The machines they make are actually based on nanomachines, and they have some kind of device strapped to them that nanomachines build what they're handcrafting. So you can get into all these kind of wacky sci-fi type ideas, but let's keep it fairly grounded here, I think. I am going to give the handcrafting one a bit of a maybe though. Immortality is a lot trickier if they are a flesh and blood alien. It's difficult to see how they would both leave a body and get moved into a new body. As I said in my analysis, there could be some sort of teleportation, leaving their clothes and a pocket dimension behind. But then you get into other questions of, does the engineer really have this one very specific psychic power? Or do they have a sort of built-in technology that they don't really make proper use of elsewhere? I mean, it'd be a lot easier to go places if you could just teleport, so why build space platforms? As such, I'm going for an unlikely here. Okay, so we see that the alien possibility is a lot more likely than the human possibility. Option 2, a future human. I'm just going to quickly touch on this one. As mentioned, the engineer could be some sort of advanced human species, perhaps one that has tinkered with its own genetics to make it stronger, faster, more resilient, etc. But the thing is, how is this actually different to the alien idea? I think we've shown they're not a present-day human, but what about human in a couple of hundred or couple of thousand years' time? However, if they're advanced enough to survive on Vulcanus unaided, then, for me, it's functionally the same and begs the same questions as the alien idea. What I'm therefore going to do is just copy across all of the categories, but we will make just 2 tweaks to it. So obviously we have the same score just at the moment, but I think that the height and the strength shown in the game are very extreme, even for an advanced future human. In particular, I don't know why height would have been increased so much. As we mentioned, they're of the scale of being tens of meters tall. that doesn't really make sense as a practical augmentation for humanity. The strength would come along with increased height, obviously, because of increased muscles, but we do also get into the territory on that sort of scale that the human skeleton, etc., wouldn't take it, and so if you get too far away, it's not really human anymore. So I'm going to bump height and strength down to just possible. That therefore reduces the score down to 51%, so it's less likely than an alien. Option 3. A robot or artificial intelligence. I think there's a very distinct possibility that the engineer is a robot powered by an AI. I'm lumping these two together because I think a robot is more the form factor, the body, whereas the AI is the intelligence that's driving that robot. So let's run through the options for this idea as well. If it's a robot, then height and strength can be whatever they're built to be, so those have to be a yes. Damage resistance and the ability to heal, to me, make a lot of sense if it's a robot. If it takes any damage, then it can heal, which is to say rebuild itself, much more easily than a human or alien could do. This option could even explain the fish question. It could be changing the fish's biomass into an organic plastic that it's using to repair itself. However, I do think that maybe the healing is perhaps a bit too fast, so I'm going to make that a likely where damage resistance is a yes. Okay, so this is looking really strong. Physical robustness is again another one that you could see no real problem with the robot being a much more robust frame, much more robust design. However, the conditions on the planet are extreme, like really extreme. And a robot body that was able to withstand all of them doesn't seem like it's a 100% perfect fit, but a really likely candidate. Intelligence is something you'd assume would be high, although it may not be appropriate to think of intelligence in quite the same way that we would for an organic creature. Certainly you'd expect knowledge not to be a problem. It's just space on the hard drive after all. So it's a yes there too. And if it's a robot, then it could be powered by some sort of nuclear power source or solar panels or a combination of both. So it wouldn't need food or water, making the sustenance question a yes too. I'd even say we're in the territory of having a much better explanation for the whole immortality question. Perhaps the spaceship is making a backup, autosave, of the engineer's consciousness, and when you die, it simply uploads that into a new robot body. Quite where this body comes from isn't clear, but we don't really know the actual timescales here. It could take hours for the body to be assembled, but from our perspective it's instantaneous, because we were not conscious while it was happening. Or this could be the whole nanomachines thing again. They could be building a new body for you. So I'm going to go for a yes for immortality too. This whole robot idea also provides a good explanation for the crafting question too. Even if it's not nanomachines, this is easier to explain if the engineer is a robot. Perhaps there's a part of the body that can assemble things while it does other stuff. So this is looking really likely. We've got 96% probability. But why do I say AI? It could be that it's a organic being's consciousness that has been transferred into a robot body. But to me, this option isn't really all that different from an AI. The AI we're talking about is what I would call a proper AI, so a true, self-aware, fully intelligent, artificially created being. And the whole point of that, the whole point of an AI that achieves sentience, is that it is a living organism. It's just not living in the organic sense. So the transfer of a alien or human consciousness into such a robot body is functionally the same thing. But you could also take that as being some sort of cyborg. So let's look at that option. Option 4, a cyborg. So I'm just going to go through this one relatively quickly because to me it's not that different to the argument I use for the future of human argument. But for this option, let's think about a combination between organic and inorganic components in some form of cyborg. For those that know, think Mechanicus Tech Priest in Warhammer 40,000. Most, if not all, of their organics have been replaced by mechanical components. Perhaps even their brains, or perhaps their consciousness has been uploaded into the machine. I do think this is a likely option, but as with the whole future human suggestion, in practice, it's not really that different to the engineer being a robot. Indeed, it has a few areas where it's less good. Any organic component is more likely to mean the engineer needs food and water, so I think sustenance drops to unlikely. And organic parts are more likely to be susceptible to damage and would be more difficult to heal. But the inorganic parts would still mean it would be faster, so I'm dropping these down. I feel that organics also make the engineer less able to cope with the harsh conditions on other planets. It could also easily have some sort of manufacturing part that addresses their handcrafting question, so I think that stays the same. And intelligence and knowledge could be augmented within organics, so that stays a yes too. And we could imagine them being taller and stronger as well. But other than the whole downloaded consciousness idea, it's difficult for me to see how they'd become immortal. Teleportation maybe does still work, but rebuilding begs the question, if their new body has organic parts, how are these being added? So for me, if it's a cyborg, then it's likely an uploaded consciousness rather than a combined machine and organic body. And this makes it functionally the same as the AI in a robot body idea. Okay, so this is looking a lot like the engineer is a robot, right? But what type of robot? I know there's a fairly popular theory about the engineer being a von Neumann probe, but I don't think I agree with this. If you've never encountered this idea before, then it's a self-replicating probe that arrives on a planet and then converts the local resources into copies of itself. These copies then head out to make copies on new planets and thereby spread themselves further. The reason for building something like that are various, but it's a fairly efficient way to find other life. Well, on a time-agnostic scale anyway, it would take millions of years, but if it's all robots, then this doesn't really matter. It could be also a related idea of a robot sent out to prepare the way for colonisation. But I don't think either of these ideas makes sense in the context of what we do. We clearly crash on the planet, which is a weird thing for a von Neumann probe to do. Why run the risk of completely destroying itself? Also, do we really act like a von Neumann probe would? We don't really build a copy of ourselves, not even in an abstract sense. We build a factory, and that factory does science. Or, if we were some robot sent to either colonise Nauvis or prep it for colonisation, then, again, crash landing is an odd choice for that. It's also difficult to see how what we do is really about prepping the way for colonisation. Again, we do some science, and that's about it. Of course, maybe it is one of these two ideas, and crashing wasn't the original plan. But the whole debris field from the shattered planet caused us some problems. I've actually a video coming up on what happened in the Nauvis system to cause a planet to shatter, so I'll leave that point for then. But I think the idea of it being a species of AI, or simply a culture that has moved beyond the flesh and lives in a robot bodies, is probably the most likely idea. Well, until we start to think more closely about their behaviour. Are we the... For me, none of these ideas really cut to the heart of what the engineer is. The baddie. Let's consider the big thing I've completely ignored, the engineer's behaviour. First, we crash on a planet that's not ours and proceed to destroy the environment with unchecked pollution. We can reduce the amount of pollution we produce, but we really don't do anything to clean it up. Second, if we want some more resources, we take the approach of wiping out the local wildlife that's in the way. There's no thought of relocating the biters or anything like that. Third, when the biters try to find a new home, or even just try to protect themselves, we obliterate them. Fourth, we then go to other planets where we exterminate an ancient and long-lived species that's perfectly happy to leave us alone, just because we want some more rocks. We kill off the local wildlife on another planet if it dares to eat any of the fruit we cultivate. A fruit that is their natural foodstuff. On that same planet, we then capture and imprison their young, force-feeding them to produce resources we want. Back on Nauvis, presumably inspired by all this horror, we turn the biters' homes into labs and process their children into science. We even go to an ancient planet where there are untold archaeological riches and things we can learn, and we destroy the buildings and treat the artifacts as scrap that we can recycle. A species that is an AI makes the most sense. They view all organic life as resources to be harvested when useful and destroyed when they're in the way. And worst of all, maybe they're an AI we created. Yup, we're the bad guys. And I'm only slightly joking. I mean, who exactly was it that shattered that planet?